This is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. You know, Dr. Bashah and I have received hundreds of different people who have had family members who have been sucked into ideologies. Today, we're going to talk about not only how cults and addictive ideologies can have strong similarities, but we're also going to talk about how do we cure this? How do we help a family member who's being sucked into an ideology, whether it's a radical Islamic ideology or an alt-right ideology or a woke left ideology? How do we help them restore their sense of agency? And when it gets to the point of needing a psychologist, how is it that psychologists can actually deal with this? Dr. Bashah has been on the forefront of this issue and trying to talk about how it is that we not only diagnose, but how it is that we prescribe for people who have these addictive ideologies. I think you're going to enjoy the show and useful. Thanks again for being here. Dr. Bashah, welcome to the Optimistic American show today.
Thank you, Paul. I'm excited to do this show. I think I'm hoping that it offers a lot of help to people that have written to us.
Yeah, we have received, as you know, tons of calls and letters from people who have family members that are involved in addictive ideologies, or in some cases worse, things like cults. And we just thought that it was important to try to clarify a number of questions that they're asking on air so that they can see what the answers are, so they can have a better understanding of what actually an addictive ideology is. And most importantly, at the end of this, we're going to talk a lot about how do you treat it, both how do you treat it professionally and what can we do as individuals to be helpful on it. So thank you for being here to talk about those subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're also in the works of putting together a tip worksheet that can be useful and have some resources there for listeners to direct them to additional advice for their family members or for themselves, and also some good articles that have been published on this topic.
All right, so let's start with the process that we'll follow through so people know what we're going to do. We'll start by talking about what is the difference between a cult and an addictive ideology. What are the ways that people are drawn in to an addictive ideology? What effects can it have on their life? And then we'll get to, at the end, what is it that we can do as individuals to help family members or other people that we care about that we see that are being drawn into these extreme measures. We all know it's not hard to watch what's going on television to see the obvious effects of what are happening with ideologies that are drawing people into some of these extreme movements. I think it's important to talk about, and we'll talk a little bit about this as well, that it's not just the right. Much of what we see on television is what's happening with the extreme right, but there's an extreme left out there that's being affected as well. But before we do that, let's go to this idea of cults. What is the difference between an addictive ideology and a cult? And I know that in many cases it's a fine line, but help us put some definition around that.
Yeah, so typically with cults, you see that there's an authoritarian leader or cult leader, and they're really demanding complete obedience and control over one's life, over their finances, over who they spend time with, over what they spend their time on. And you see that there's this buy-in over time, and over time, they're going to be asking for more and more things from this person, whether it's work that they're doing for free, massive amounts of donations of their family income, alienating them from people that they know and love who may be against them being drawn into these cults. Now, with addictive ideologies, you may see that there are some belief systems or some leaders, but they're more disparate, and they tend to have that dark triad that we had talked about in earlier podcasts, where there may be narcissistic, so they want total self-admiration. They also are seeking control, but through manipulation or charismatic charm. and they may have the Machiavellian traits and psychopathic tendencies. And so it doesn't have to be a particular leader. It could be a radicalization or indoctrination program through social media. So it can be more dispersed, and it's really hard to pinpoint one person that is doing this.
So to give some examples, so
Yeah.
we can put some structure around it. It's easy to know, like what happened with Jamestown, or maybe more specifically the Moonies. I had a friend of mine who was an actual deprogrammer. He would go around, he would people would call in about their children that had gotten into the Hare Krishnas or the Moonies or any one of a number of other groups, and he would literally kidnap them and then take them out and deprogram them. A very controversial set of, I guess you would call it a therapy, although I'm not quite sure that that's what it was, but it was they had a process that they would follow to try to deprogram kids that were in it. First, they would try to try to get them to talking about some type of logic, and then they would get them to see that the leader had corrupt values and wasn't really what they thought, and then they would try to get them to talk about what it was that they really wanted. And as they began to show the inconsistencies, the hope was that they could deprogram. I can tell you from listening to him, they were only about 50% effective, that a lot of the kids just went right back to the effort. But they all had this authoritarian figure inside the cult that could kind of draw you in. Now, you may find some exceptions to that, but nonetheless, that tends to be a big cult type issue. Whereas when you're talking about an addictive ideology, again, it can be on the right or the left, but you'll find that oftentimes people are being drawn in not by one figure, but by multiple figures, multiple people. And so they may be, it may be someone online who has put up a program that's trying to convince you to come in or to take part in the program, that they're trying to convince you that things are wrong, and they're trying to get you to adopt kind of their ideology. And I think this is important because one of the things that we think exists in addictive ideologies, whether it's on the right or the left, these are groups who believe that there is an oppressed and an oppressor, the ones that are the most dangerous, the ones that become the most dangerous. And again, you can find that on the right and the left. The Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers believe that on one side, and the woke left believes that on the other, that there's an oppressed and an oppressor. And so they classify people based upon their group. The second thing, though, that happens that I think is important is that they're both really looking for a revolution. They don't like democracy because the things that they're really trying to promote, they don't have any chance of convincing the majority of being a good idea. So what they do instead is they try to convince them of the faults of the status quo, of the existing problem, without really spending a lot of time on what is this alternative vision? Where has it worked? What would it look like? What would really happen if it was actually implemented? What type of control would individuals continue to have? But they're trying to undermine the existing system of free markets, capitalism, an individualistic society that's based upon a constitution that grants us all a set of rights. Now, those two groups you spoke about a moment ago, both of them, or whether they're on the right or the left, let's set cults aside now, the leaders of them generally have this dark triad of personality traits. I know you already spoke about it, but let's talk a little bit more in detail about what the characteristical traits are of those types of people.
Yes, they really are very charming, charismatic, seductive, and they really are offering a simple solution to people who feel wronged. And so they'll amplify the sense of you've been victimized. And there is this gaslighting that happens as well, like, a way of psychological destabilization of another person, as if to say, I have all the answers for you. This is the right way of thinking about this. Let me offer you the solution, and maybe giving them or turning things on its head in a way that they're more likely to be manipulative and coercive. And it's a foot in the door technique, which is called, it's a way of persuading a person where you're just giving a little bit and a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more at a time. So it's hard for a person who's really in that process to see, like, hey, I just got punched in the face. That's wrong. But when you see that you're the one who's actually giving this person something of yours, whether it's time, finances, engaging in ritualistic behavior, giving full obedience to what they're asking of you, that over time you become convinced, like, I must be doing the right thing because look at all that I've already committed. And then before you know it, people have invested their whole life savings, and that's when they're totally lost. The issue is it's a loss of identity or replacement of identity. So they lose touch with who they used to be, and they replace it with this other identity, which these leaders very carefully craft and offer. So it's very powerful. It's hard to see, and it's almost like the circular logic that ends up happening. There was a person who ended up leaving a cult and was talking about her process. And she says, when people tried to talk to me logically and help me to see what I was doing, it really didn't matter what they were saying. I was so engrossed and bought in to this cult ideology that there was no way of rationalizing me out of it. And so it took a long time for people then to see what was going on, to slowly start getting back to who they were. And this is where you and I will talk about different ways of treating or working with people who are addicted to these ideologies and different forms of extremism.
All right, so I'm going to come back in a moment to people that you've worked with on both the right and the left that have been addicted. But I want to talk for just a moment about whether or not this is a purely a right-wing issue or a left-wing issue. First, you don't have to take it from me. You can listen to the Justice Department. The Justice Department, they've identified groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and other right-wing organizations that are part of the alt-right as being violent terrorist groups. And they have an indoctrination for their ideology that they try to suck you into it. On the left, you can find other groups like the John Brown Gun Club, or in the past, the Black Panthers, or for that matter, Antifa. I've always thought that everybody should be anti-fascist, but if you have to wear a mask, you're no longer an anti-fascist, you're a thug. You're somebody who's trying to beat or hurt someone else, or you're afraid of exposing your identity, which is really no different than the people who want to give dark money into the system, right? The democracy demands that we have people that are willing to stand up and be accountable for the things that they do. But when you start to see things as a group identity, you begin to lose the importance of that accountability, because what an ideology does is it allows us to begin to see the other people as being the oppressor. Now, that could be the liberal media, the liberal elite, the Democrats. It could be the Republicans, the Trumpers, the MAGA party, whatever it is that you want to apply as being that oppressor. But once you can begin to separate people by groups instead of individuals, you can remove that evil that's inside of each one of us that we all have to be accountable for, that we all have to watch for. And we can say, no, I'm good, they're evil. And once you do that, you can begin to objectify people, and you can take it to the next step.
Yeah, can I add one more thing to that? So the other part of this, like, propaganda that they're teaching is that their beliefs are superior to the others. So not only have they wronged us, whoever that outgroup is, and they are the oppressors, and we are justified there is violence that is condoned and vengeance that is condoned. It also amplifies this sense of paranoia. Conspiracy theories tend to also drive a lot of these belief systems. But there's also this polarization in their thought process in followers that become more black and white thinking. So this is something else to really help identify somebody who's been indoctrinated or radicalized, that it's really hard to have conversations with them because everything is so dogmatic and radicalized in their views and so black and white.
Yeah, and we had a good program on in one of the past sessions where we talked with psychologists who talked about how to talk to crazy people, about how difficult
That's
it
his
can
book
be.
title.
That's his book, right?
Yeah, we're not trying to identify people in such a way, but that was his book, How to Talk to Crazies. Yeah, he got into a lot of trouble with the different associations, the psychiatric and psychological associations, because of his title.
All right, now I want to hit on, before we go to a couple of your clients, one more thing, because I think it's important, and it's this idea of woke culture. First, up front, I will say the definition of woke culture is lucid. It's not really clear. The right identifies it one way. There are people who are in critical race theory and other ideologies on the left that define it differently. If you go to the dictionary, it's really defined pretty simply. It says that it's awakening to racial injustice. And I think most people would say, well, of course we should be aware of racial injustice. That's something that we should be concerned about. But when you start getting into the deeper philosophical roots of many of the people who are engaged with it, they start buying into many of the postmodern ideas that, again, see the world as kind of an oppressed versus an oppressor outlook. And so things like critical race theory, the 1619 Project, systematic racism. They believe that there's systematic racism in everything, including the capitalistic system. And again, what are the people on the extremes promoting? Revolution. They're promoting overthrowing the existing system, right? And again, that's generally without a lot of regard to what would you replace that with? What would that look like? And where has that worked? All right, it's just simply
aside from pure anarchy.
It's a criticism of the status quo.
Yeah,
because it's
with no
easier
solution
to criticize the status quo without talking about the alternative. Now, I happen to think that the whole reason our system works is because of the philosophy, not the psychology, but the philosophy of individualism that was put in at our core. It created an incredible union because it empowered the individual over government. And in doing that, it gave them the right to develop products and goods and land and art and music and a whole set of things without it being considered to be a means of propaganda for the state. Right? It empowered the individual to the point that our individuals are much more powerful in this country, individually and collectively, than is government. Woke culture has, again, differing people in it. There are some people who just are the true believers who say, well, I think that it's about racial injustice. But there's a dark triad of people who are promoting something much more insidious with woke culture that we need to be concerned about. They're promoting an addictive ideology. Now, what I'd like to do for a moment is I'd like to talk about your experience. You've worked with lots of different people that are in prison that have been sucked into ideologies. The two that I'd like to focus on, kind of one from the right and one more from the left, although I'm not sure that it's fair to categorize them in either one of those two categories. But one are extremist Muslims, and the other is the incel community. So let's start with your experience with people who have been indoctrinated into those programs. Why don't we start by explaining a little bit about what incel is? Because I think by itself, most people don't even understand that it exists and the role that it's beginning to play and the effect that it has on people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main thing is really looking at where is the harm and where is the harm at the individual level that's being committed and where is the harm at more of a contextual environmental level, whether that's a person's family or their community or if they're engaging in some kind of violence. And I think just what you were describing earlier really made me think of the whole point of our book and what we were writing about in our book, Addictive Ideologies, at the individual level is this real sense of relinquishing self-agency, relinquishing responsibility and accountability for one's actions, and giving up one's power and control. Now, they may be deceived in thinking that, no, I'm doing the right thing, and this belief is superior, and I'm right, and you're wrong, and you're the bad guy, I'm the good guy. But really, when you step back and look at it objectively, where is the harm that's being committed? I think some of the risk factors, and I'll give some richer examples that are a bit different, so we can see how somebody can get pulled in depending, like, across different forms of extremism and ideologies. But some of the risk factors that I was reading in a great article was that if a person has a death of a loved one, if they have a history of sexual trauma, or if they have a history of childhood trauma, that they're more likely at risk. If they have any, like, learning or communication disorders, or autism spectrum disorders, if their disorders alienate or socially keep them isolated, and if they develop some kind of other addictions, whether that's online addictions or to social media, or alcohol and drugs, and if they've had a recent loss, or even questioning, like a spiritual quest, if they feel lost in the world, and they're trying to find themselves. So all of these are some vulnerability factors that research has really helped to set out. So these are some things, if you see in yourself, just know that these are vulnerability factors in yourself, or if you see in a loved one. Because I think part of our work, Paul, is that not only do we want to help people who have been pulled into these ideologies, we also want to offer some prevention strategies to prevent people from being pulled in. So if we can see what these risk factors are, we can maybe stop it before it starts. Now, over time, there's been things like COVID. There are, like, 21st century contributions to risk factors that have isolated people. The social and political polarization that's happening in our country is also increasing risk factors for people. Increases in internet addictions, increased time online, increased use of scams, and conspiracy theories that are out there. These are all things that are seductive and can pull people who are vulnerable in, and also lack of touch, isolation, and like social distancing that has happened because of the pandemic. Increased sense of paranoia, depression, and suicidal risk that we see have increased during the time of the pandemic, and it has continued. So all of those things are some real risk factors. So going back to different forms of ideology. So incel ideology, it actually stands for involuntary celibates. So these are young males who want sex and can't have it, and are rejected by attractive females, young females, on the basis of either a physical deformity or a social or emotional or mental problem or deformity. So something that they've been rejected maybe because they have autism spectrum disorder, or they have other social awkwardness, or they don't know how to relate to people. They lack some of the emotional communication skills. They're just not savvy or charismatic or charming or attractive or athletic. So they're angry, and their target tend to be attractive young females.
So let's clarify this for a moment, because I think it's important. So these young people, young men who oftentimes are drawn into this, they create a sense of a justification of violence because they believe that there are a whole group of women who, by the way, actually they think aren't as attractive, that should be more available to them, but they blame it on women being gay or on women all wanting the same guys that the more attractive women want. They actually have names for all of. They actually have an entire language. But
That's right.
But here's what's important in this. We talk about the deformity. So the idea that you're involuntarily celibate. I can tell you, I was a nerd in high school. And almost every single one of my buddies would have said we were involuntarily celibate, right? we weren't celibate by choice, right? Yeah, we were celibate because we couldn't get a girlfriend. We couldn't get anybody to go out with us, right? Well, what this ideology does is it begins to create a sense of victimhood for that group of people, that the reason that this is happening to you is because of the order of society that's been created that does damage to your ability to be able to get a girlfriend or to have a date, and that it wasn't always this way. Now, I'm not sure what it was like back in the dark ages when they had arranged marriages, but I know during the entire time I've been alive, this is not a new phenomena that young men have a problem being able to get a girlfriend when they're in junior high or in high school, right? That's something that just kind of washes its way through. But what the ideology is designed to do is to turn them into a victim, to begin to make them think that they've been wronged, and then to begin to give them a language and a set of tools that can give them logical, or what seem like logical, arguments for what it is that they're trying to promote. And what they're trying to promote is basically this: you have a right to harm women because you've been involuntarily raped by them, right? It's a reversal of everything. You wouldn't think that it would work, except who their targets are, right? They're young men, usually pretty young men, who are loners, who've been isolated, who feel like they don't quite fit in, and they're looking for something to belong to. And all of a sudden, they're given the tools of belonging through a different vocabulary, a different language, a story that's being told to them. And literally, they can get wrapped into that online without you as a parent even knowing that it's beginning to take place.
And they see these acts as being praised. They want to be famous. And by being a mass shooter is something that may become desirable because
one of their heroes, I think, was a mass shooter.
They see
a couple of their shooters.
Yeah, Elliot Rodgers was one historically in 2014. Killed, I believe it was 6 or 7 people, and he has a very strong following online. And there are ways that, like you said, you feel special because now you have this special language that you're using. You identify with other young Caucasian males, and you have a group that you hate and that you've identified. Not only do you hate the men who are obtaining sex and are attractive, but you're really hating the women who are having sex with these people, and they're
the women
rejecting
who aren't
you.
having sex with them.
Yeah.
Because you feel that woman should be yours.
Yeah, and so it's creating this justification, but it's really hard to track. And in the U.S. right now, they're saying they identify incel ideology as an extremist group. And really looking at monitoring. It's very hard to monitor how many people are really following this group online. So there's a number of individuals I have evaluated and some of the added risk factors that I see. And not only do they feel that they get to leave a legacy behind through these mass shootings, and they want that credibility, but there's also this suicidal risk that increases, and they're more likely to then engage in the homicides and become a mass shooter as their suicidality increases.
And how did they, when you've interviewed them, how did they express their justification for harming a woman or harming, or whether it be rape or murder or actually physically harming them? How do they justify that?
Some of it it may be mixed in with mental illness, and so there may be these paranoid delusions that are influencing their thought process, and so it's not really entirely logical or rational, just a real perseveration and obsession about that they deserved this, and it's not fair what they've done, or it's not fair that they've rejected me, and just this real deep obsession, whether they're targeting a particular woman or that they're fantasizing or obsessed about, or whether it's just a group that they're wanting to target.
Okay, I want to hold that now, because it's not fair. So now let's go to people that you've evaluated that have been involved in terrorist acts that were Islamic extremists. What were the similarities? How did they get there?
So some of the similarities that I saw was deep forms of trauma, unresolved trauma, and that the groups that they were blaming were like Western values, or even...
By the way, I believe that's an ideology all by itself. People say, what is Vladimir Putin's ideology? And that's easy. Anti-Westernism.
Yes.
That is an ideology. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's not like a singular person that you're blaming, like incel ideology, young, attractive women. It is a whole value system that is a threat to my existence, to the stabilization of my people, to my ethnic group, and that can be enough to justify acts of violence. And again, there is these risk factors that really follow in suit with that social isolation, the alienation, feeling like they've been harmed, especially complex by mental illness, if that is in existence, depression or substance use, and people who are prone to becoming radicalized or indoctrinated even online. I see that they're given a sense of meaning and purpose, and motivation comes from this driving force that this must be done. And again, that black and white thinking tends to come out, like this is the right thing to do.
So let's do a little comparison now. The Capitol riot that took place, where people stormed the Capitol and busted down doors and defecated on the Senate floor and threatened representatives, incel members that you've interviewed, and then people involved in radical Islamic movements. Now, here's the comparison that I want to make. Oftentimes, I will hear people say, "Well, the people who broke into the Capitol, they had a mass delusion. They were delusional." Right? In your experience, is that generally the case?
No, and it's wrong to apply that word generally to groups, because it's not necessarily the case. Maybe at an individual level, you may have people who do suffer from some form of mental illness where they do really meet that threshold and criteria for delusions, and that has to be assessed on an individual basis.
I think the reason they say that is because the rest of us watch them, and then we listen to them talk to us, and we go, oh my gosh, that you must be delusional. This whole framework that you have for thinking, it's so far off.
But it is a subculture. And so in the definition of a delusion, it cannot be better explained by culture or a subgroup or subculture that are operating on a group of norms that is expected and is standard for that belief system that exists within that subculture.
What's important about this concept, and it's, to me, it's fascinating to listen to, but what's important about this concept that through my conversations with you, I really began to gain a better understanding of, is that it's not mental illness because you change your framework of thinking.
Exactly.
Right? They have a construct of how they see the world. And again, I'm going to go back to, it's generally a revolutionary construct. It's one that says that the existing status quo is unfair to me, right? And the existing status quo, which focuses on individualism and free markets and the ability to own property and to have free speech and to have all those things, their view is That's doing the damage to me, and they create an alternative construct. And in all three of those cases, and add woke culture right to that, at least the definition that I use for woke culture, all four of them, they're just buying into an alternative construct. That doesn't make them crazy. That doesn't make them delusional. It just simply means that they've come up with an alternative view of the world. Now, usually that view is being promoted by a smaller group of people who may have these dark triad personality traits, meaning they're manipulating them. They're manipulating them to get them to do what they want them to do. But they're generally manipulating people who've had some trauma, who've had some problem or challenge in their life, who feel like they haven't been seen, they feel like they're invisible. It was an obvious target that they were going to, someone someday would go get white men, right? The average Trump supporter, this doesn't mean all Trump supporters. I want to be clear on this. There are some wealthy people who are Trump supporters, there are some Hispanics, there are some blacks, but the average Trump supporter is a white male that's over 50 years old with less than $1,000 in his pocket. I'm offended by people who say, well, if you voted for Trump once, you can be forgiven. But if you did it a second time, you're a bad person. What makes that person a bad person, right? You can just hear that story. Over 50 years old white male with less than $1,000 in their bank account and go, yeah, they're challenged, right? And you can see what's happened in society, right? I've always been a supporter of civil rights and equal rights and human rights, but the consequences to those things and the consequences to globalism had an effect on many white working men who worked in industry or manufacturing, and all of a sudden they're facing everything from affirmative action, which kind of is having a displacement of them, environmental rules that are maybe putting their companies out of business, the Me Too movement that is basically saying, hey, no matter what, the male is guilty, right? Or people using words like white privilege as if everybody who is white must be privileged or part of a patriarchy. And so what do? Well, they can't speak up. They're not articulate enough oftentimes to speak up. And if they do, they're just going to get beat along the side of the head. So they go quiet. They become invisible. It wasn't sooner or later somebody was going to walk by them and say, hey, I see you. And I know your pain. And they're going to start talking about their pain through kind of dog whistle-like comments. And when they did that, they would follow them no matter where they went, no matter what crime they committed, no matter what they did wrong. I do think, this is a different show, but I do think that it's incumbent upon us to reach out to all people in our society, to recognize that all of us should have a right to participate and to avoid language that takes some people and moves them to the margins. But those are the people we're talking about. That can be that can be a Muslim, not a radical Muslim in the beginning. It can be a Muslim young boy who feels isolated. That can be a young boy who feels like he can't get a date. That can be somebody who feels like that they've been isolated because of their jobs. Those people who have been isolated and that have faced traumas are easier to suck into those types of ideologies with people who have Machiavellian, narcissistic, pathological mindsets that don't care who they hurt.
Yeah, and I can't help but think of, so much of what you're saying helps to also build the case for prevention efforts. And, there's the recommendations that you have in what you just described that I think is going to be important in trying to move this nation and communities and even at an individual level forward in order to protect and prevent this further growing rise of extremism and hate and radicalization.
All right, so let's talk about it. Let's go to what you are an expert at, which is how do you provide treatment for people? And let's just think about some of the people who have written in that have talked about their family members that they've seen becoming more isolated, that have become less a part of the family, that they see that they're moving into whatever movement that fits their identity. The first question is, what is happening in that environment with that individual as they start to move into it? What actually is physically taking place, mentally that's taking place as they begin to get sucked into that ideology?
Well, one of the really important psychological components that I think probably some of this research spends some time on, but probably not enough, is this identity part. Because I think it's so important. If somebody has this destabilization in their identity, or their identity feels crippled in some way, that they feel that they've been wronged based on their identity, or that there's been some kind of trauma or loss in their life, that they're questioning their spirituality or their religion or who they are, at that deep structural foundational level, they're going to be seeking and searching. And then I think this is also what makes them quite vulnerable to charismatic leaders who maybe have that charm, manipulation, that really help to suck them in and exploit them, or even just something that they come across online, and the ritualization of behaviors and the prescriptions that are given, I think helps to give structure to someone who doesn't necessarily feel that they have a path or a destination, or self-discipline or structure in their lives. So it can be helpful on some levels. I think it's important to not see it as all wrong, all pathological. There's actually some benefit that they're gaining, whether it's like the replacement of the death of a father, through a charismatic and charming male older leader or elder in a community. There could be all kinds of things that make these unique factors make a person very susceptible to leaning in and giving more and more up of themselves. One of the things that we tend to see consistently across the board is this loss of who they were, and that is getting replaced with who they're told they should be.
Interesting.
And so that part of the treatment then is to go back to reconnect with who they were, because that is them. That is a part of their identity. So whether it's reconnecting with lost friends that they cut off, or family members that they cut off, maybe it was hobbies and interests that they were really driven by, things that would bring them meaning or fulfillment or purpose or happiness or joy, things that they love to do.
So before we go into talking about how to talk to someone who's engaged in this that you care about, let's talk about, I think it's important to talk about, why is this like an addiction? Chemically, what's actually happening to someone who engages in an ideology, or that, and you know, where the ideology provides them benefits from being able to debate or to have an argument or a discussion with someone? What actually is chemically going on inside their mind, and why is it like an addiction?
Well, let's think about what is happening in the brain during an argument. So if somebody is pushing their point and proving their point, feel like they're winning the argument, there's these excitatory responses that are happening at the neuron level in the brain. And there's this dopaminergic system which is becoming activated. And there's this release of dopamine and adrenaline, which makes a person feel good and powerful. And I think that's the important. People become addicted to having that power and feeling like they're right, feeling like they want, and they want it again. That's that stimulus response system in the brain that is similar to addictions. We see that in sex addictions. We see that in porn addictions. We see that in gambling addictions and alcohol and drug addictions, that it's a similar pathway which gets excited and it's addictive. People want that hit again. And they're willing to hurt themselves and even giving up and hurting other people as a result of getting that again. And that's where the consequences are.
And what the ideology does is, let's go back to the framework thinking, right? Instead of it being a delusion, it gives them a framework that's almost an alternative reality. And so the argument becomes easier to win. Oftentimes it has a whole new language. It has a whole new set of vocabulary. It will take, here are the problems that exist in the world, here's the oppressors, and here's why this is justified. And as the member or the person who engages in it learns that, they actually feel like they're getting better at their arguments. But of course, what's really happening is, much like an alcohol addiction, as they begin to do that, the people who aren't engaged in the ideology really don't want to be around them. They want to go do something else. And so they begin to withdraw from them. And so then the only people that they're left to be attracted to end up being people who are more ideological, which is what starts leading. And there is a number of studies on this. Joyce Bellinger did a number of studies on this, that as they begin to become attracted to those, what he called obsessive ideologies, they begin to become more violent, right? So now the question is this: instead of going to how do we treat this person professionally, let's talk about how, as a family member, we can be involved in helping them. Now, again, our first instinct was withdraw from them, pull away from them. Our second instinct is to argue with them or tell them why what they're doing is wrong, right? Give them grief for what it is that they're doing. What is it that we think begins to work?
Yeah, by shaming them or telling them that they're in denial, or that their thinking is wrong, or they're not engaged in reality. That's going to further put a wedge between you and them. And the greatest protective factor that they can have is a person who loves them, who cares about them, who wants to help create some of those buffers or fencing around them. So even while they're engaging in harmful behaviors, there's some limits to how far they can go. And there's a lot of research in addictions on harm minimization. And so they say, well, abstinence might be hard to get right now, or might be too much to ask for. They're just not willing to engage in treatment to engage in abstinence. But let's maybe look at harm minimization. Let's remove some things that they're using that are hurting them and create some parameters around them. And so this can be part of a planning stage as an intervention that family members can use or utilize. And I especially recommend trying to bring in a professional that can help direct.
So let's talk about what family members, again, can do. I think you've given some great thoughts on the role that they can play. But the very first thing that you're saying to a family member, I think about this. I've had people who I have loved dearly who have had big problems with alcohol and in some cases other substances, right? And here's what I know doesn't work. Telling them that they're an alcoholic and that they need to get their act together. Right? Maybe, it helps to make them accountable by, having consequences that you actually implement. But your real ability to be able to affect them is to get them to want to fix it. Right? If they decide to deal with the alcoholism because they're doing it for you, fat chance it's going to get fixed. It's only going to get fixed because they want to. And that's the same with this addiction. If the person who's engaged with it has no desire to get help, and you'll talk about that professionally in a moment, the different stages that you go through. But if they have no desire to get help, your chances of being successful with that are much lower. So one of the things that you can do, what was the the psychologist gave us yesterday? He did a great job.
The Trifecta of Hope by
Explain
Dr.
that.
Goulston.
I thought that was beautiful.
Yes. So Dr. Goulston had described, number one, this unconditional positive regard and love that a mentor in the community had for him, especially at a point where he was quite suicidal and depressed and felt very isolated and rejected by family. And having that really helped bolster his self-esteem. He says, I don't have self-worth or value or belief in myself, and yet this other person does. The second point that he said with the Trifecta of Hope was that this person offered him a sense of purpose and meaning, that that this person knew and believed that he was capable and had the capacity to really succeed in this profession, even though Dr. Goulston doubted himself. And then the third one that he said was being seen, that this person believed in him while he had no belief in himself.
Yeah, so think about this, right? Let's just start with that first comment. If you meet with someone and you know that what they're doing is damaging to you and your family, a starting point is to say, hey, I just want you to know that, I think you're going to be challenged by what's happening on this, but no matter what, I love you. No matter what, I'm
not going to abandon you.
I'm not going to abandon you.
Yeah, that is powerful. That is an intervention in and of itself.
Because all of a sudden they know that there's a connection that matters to them, right? And then the second point is to begin to let them know that the potential that they have, whatever that potential may be, right? That you see something in them that other people don't see, that you see that there's great possibility for where they can go, right? But that's really going to be up to them. And the last one is to let them know that you see them, right? That, again, we talked about the person who felt invisible before. Letting someone know that you see them and that you understand them, that's a beginning point. That doesn't mean that you have to buy into the ideology, right? It just means that you're creating a connection point to them. Now, the next part that I think is important is it's the questions that you ask, right? If you ask questions and what you're really trying to do is you're trying to lead them into a trap, you're trying to prove to them why what they're thinking is wrong, it's going to be probably detectable.
Yeah,
but if you're asking real questions and letting them really explain what's there, in almost all of these ideologies, there are massive inconsistencies that when people talk about them enough, the inconsistencies begin to come out. The problems begin to come out. And, the problem could be as simple as this. Why are you giving up on people you love for people you don't even know? Well, why? How is that? How does that help you? How does that benefit you?
Yeah, and so one of the things in psychology that we use is the Socratic questioning. So if that was true, what does that mean? And if that is true, what does that mean? And you just kind of keep going down to a deeper level and really kind of helping to extract what is at the heart of it so that the person themselves are engaging in their own sense of self-discovery rather than you being just like an authoritarian replacement and saying, well, no, I know the answer. You're wrong. I'm right. You need to follow what I'm telling you, because that's never going to work.
One of my friends is very much, he would have been one of those persons that would have walked into the Capitol. And I spent a lot of time just talking to him and listening to him. And one of the things that he finally came to after we talked about this for a while was, well, my daughter won't talk to me anymore. And I said, why? And he said, well, because she's just one of those woke culture people and she's isolated me because of it. Well, I don't know that the daughter should have done that. But of course, the question I asked him was, well, what are you going to do about it? Right? And he said, well, there's nothing that I can do. I go, there's nothing that you can do? He goes, well, I'm not going to give up what I think. I said, oh, so to be able to keep this going, you're going to focus on this ideology instead of somebody that you care about. He kind of came to it all himself. Hey, maybe he didn't have to change his ideas to recognize maybe I'm getting carried away.
Yeah, that sense of pride or righteousness influences us to want to stand firm. Well, I'm not going to bend and be flexible. They're the ones with the rigid thinking. But if we're engaging in that rigid thinking, also a black and white thinking, that's going to further create that barrier between us and them. And what we know from research and just humanity is that, connections rely on flexibility.
In the beginning, when these divisions became stronger, my first instinct was to kind of push back because I definitely, my biggest concern is the Constitution, individual rights, this whole society that's been based upon that. And the fear of losing that caused me at times to say things to people I wish I hadn't have said. But what I found is that if you could be well-meaning and if you could be curious and really trying to help the other person as opposed to making them buy into my ideas.
That's right.
That I had a chance of people talking to me, people that I cared about talking to me. And once I got to that, fascinatingly enough, I didn't buy into their ideas, but I was fascinated by understanding them. There's a curiosity all in its own trying to understand it. Now, what I want to know next is, all right, so somebody comes in and they say, okay, I want help, right? I mean, the main thing I think we're trying to tell parents or loved ones who are engaged with them is don't give up. Don't let them separate out on their own. Don't be judgmental. Try to find ways back in. Be curious about what's going on with them. Try to understand who they are. What was their journey? How did they get to this point? What happened in their life that made them get there? And set your own aside a little bit, your own philosophy, so that you can reestablish that connection, and hopefully they value it enough that they say, okay, well, I do want to save this, and I want to save that connection with other people. But now I'm interested in someone comes in to talk to you about this from a psychological standpoint. How do you deal with it? How do you go through your process with the client?
So let's say this is a family member who's coming into me and worried about a family member,
No,
or are you talking about the specific person who's coming? Well, if that specific person's coming in, that's great because that means that they have some kind of buy-in or motivation to be there. It takes great courage to contact a psychologist and say, I need help. This is what I'm struggling with and what I'm working on. Can you see me? I mean, that is a tremendous barrier I see for so many people. So if they already have the courage to contact me and come into my office, then I'm going to work with what they're giving me to work with as a motivation. So they may not be necessarily motivated for themselves, but maybe they're motivated because they're wanting to keep their marriage. Or maybe they feel more estranged from their children and they want to preserve those relationships. They may not be as willing to disengage in the behaviors or the harm that they're continuing to be invested in, but they might be more willing to change some things for the sake of preserving something that they've lost or are losing. Whatever it is that they feel fearful of or terrified of, or whatever it is that's motivating them, I will work with it. And so I'll usually always come back to that as the motivating factor. It makes
What do you use? What's the standard or the criteria you use to evaluate them and to help them?
So there's a couple of things that are going on when I'm meeting with a person. I'm really trying to assess a prioritization of needs. Obviously, if they're a danger to themselves or others, or have a severe mental illness, or a very severe addiction problem, or something else that's going to get in the way of their therapy, I need to also pull that in and not neglect it. So what I'll be doing is assessing for risk and safety concerns and establishing a safety plan that it may involve bringing other people in to help hold them accountable, or even for themselves, holding them accountable, and what that might look like. If they can agree to that plan, help formulate that plan, be a part of that plan, then they're going to be more invested in it. And that's an ideal scenario. Sometimes if a person is not buying into it and there are those excessive risk factors, I might have to be working with other family members or bringing other people in to help build some of those safety parameters. And it's all individualized and on a case-by-case scenario, so it's hard to really give. I know I'm talking in very general terms. But that's important. That has to happen. The next thing, we have a couple theories and models to help us guide us. So with addictions, which we use with substance use addictions, that also I think can work really well with ideological addictions, there's the stages of change model. So what that means is people may be in different phases or stages of being motivated to help themselves. So there's a pre-contemplative stage, which means that they're in denial. They don't see that they have a problem. It's everybody else's problem. They're absolutely not invested in changing anything that they have going on. And they're most likely not going to be in therapy because they just don't see that they have a problem. So those are the people that tend to like be brought in by family, or it's family that are actually coming into my office, not them. So they're the hardest to work with, and really you want to try to move them into contemplative phase. So the next stage is contemplation. This is a person that says, I know that I have a problem, but I'm really not willing to do anything different. But I could see how it's hurting me and it's hurting other people. The next stage is planning. So that's a person who says, I have a problem. I could see how it's hurting me and other people. I do want help. I'm just not ready to do anything differently, but I could see that this would help me if I, started spending less time on the internet, started really distancing myself from this social media platform or these tens of conspiracy theorists or ideologies, spending less time with these people, that this would help me, and maybe gravitating more towards those identity affirming behaviors that I was talking about before that help bringing them back to the identity that they once had and lost or felt distance from. But they are not quite ready to really engage in doing things. So the next stage is action. So this is the person that identifies they have the problem, see that they're hurting themselves and others. They have a plan in place, and now they're motivated. They're going to start doing it. It's great to see people because in that stage, they really have the momentum to keep going. The next phase is maintenance. So now they've really worked in stabilizing their lives. Things are coming together quite nicely for them. There's a sense of healing. There's a recovery identity process that's happening that they're engaged in. And really, it's a matter of maintaining them there. And then the next phase is relapse. And I love that relapse is a part of the stage because it shows that any one of us are susceptible to falling back to where we were. Just because we get there and are, in recovery, healed, working the steps, it doesn't mean that we can't slip. We're human. We make mistakes, and it's okay. It just means we have to start that all over again. Maybe it'll be a bit quicker to start, a bit quicker to move through the different stages, but it is a part of that model. There are some nuances with this model, so we can see that people might be in between some stages, right? They might vacillate between stage 2 and stage 3, or contemplation and planning, or planning and action. So you might see that they take a couple steps forward and then a step backwards, and that's okay. That happens. The model that we use, or the theory that helps with this model, is motivational interviewing. There's a lot of books on it. If you're interested, family members can also read. And it really helps, as we were describing, how do you have conversations with somebody who's in a pre-contemplative stage and you want to move them to a contemplative stage. And so a lot of it is creating that therapeutic alliance, building your relationship, building trust and safety and esteem in your relationship, fostering hope, helping that person really derive a sense of agency, that they're still in control of their lives, not you, and really asking them these non-judgmental questions that are driven out of curiosity. And it may involve asking them questions about their past, maybe asking them questions about their future, helping them to evaluate their lives in ways in which makes them going from stuck to unstuck. So there are different therapeutic techniques to do that. These are a lot of the theories and philosophies that are driving some of the treatments in addiction and addictive ideologies today.
All right. So here's what I like about this. At first, it's always amazing to me how much of this goes back to our hierarchy of agency we placed in our book, right? It starts with knowing the truth and thinking about who you are and what it is that you want to be. The second is recognizing that you're an individual. And as an individual, the good thing about our society is you can always begin anew. All right, but you are an individual and you are deserving and worthy of dignity. The third part is you have to build strength. right? That becomes an important component, and strength comes from resilience. The love and connection part, though, that's the part that I just want to hit on for 1 second, because I think it's the right way to end this. You talked about what was actually going on in the brain neurologically that made people addicted to the ideology. The idea that there were a set of hormones that were being released that included endorphins as well as dopamine. The dopamine is a drug that you actually begin to want more of. That comes from your ability to sound smarter, to do better in an argument, to feel like you're winning, to feel like you're kind of on top of the game. It's all those highs that you get from the dopamine. Well, there's also another chemical that's released when you find connection. And there's little doubt about this. The connection and love that you're going to find, you are not going to find it online.
Yeah.
Right?
And that releases oxytocin, the feel-good hormones.
Right.
Yeah.
But when you're connected to someone, when you feel that they love you and you love them, that chemical gets released. And it is as powerful as dopamine. And that oxytocin, when it's released, gives us an ability to want more. The answer, whether it's I'm a parent, I'm a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, and I'm trying to help somebody get out of it, or I'm somebody that's in it that's trying to find my way out, that sense of love and connection is what's going to replace that high that we've gained from being a part of a addictive ideology that is going to do the exact opposite. It's going to break apart those relationships that you care about.
Yeah, and I think, just to summarize, one of the main things that, if you're a family member that really cares about somebody that's stuck in this addictive ideology, not shaming them, not making them feel guilty, not rejecting them or invalidating them, but saying, I see you and I believe in you. There is this notion of scaffolding, which we use for children in children's development, social, emotional, and physical development. And it's basically the idea is saying, I accept you for where you are now, but I'm going to expect just a little bit more. And so you're always, and I use this in therapy all the time, I always, just pushing a little more, expecting a little more, demanding a little more. And it's saying, I believe that you can do this. I believe that you're competent and capable of doing this. And when you give that belief to another person, you'd be surprised that, there is that courage and capability. Now with children, we're obviously like trying to put things in their environment. So it pushes them to explore on their own, try new things, challenge themselves, even if they are going to fail. And the same thing can be said for, this approach in therapy and in healing and fostering relationships that have been broken, is this notion of scaffolding. I accept you for who you are.
And imagine in our society that this whole idea of shaming that you talked about.
Yeah, you may not agree with their behaviors, and I'm not saying that acceptance necessarily is saying I condone what you've done or are doing. That's not what this is.
Right. But on the nightly news or in almost anything that you can watch, that shaming is happening daily. Right? We're taking people who have ideas that think differently than we think, and we are shaming them. We're talking bad about them. We're talking about why it is that they're evil or why it is that they're deficient. That doesn't make them better. It makes them more resolved to stand up to you. It makes them more resolved to be angry. It makes them feel as if you're looking down upon them. And there is no way we're going to fix the divisions in this country by looking down on the other parts of our society. It's just not going to happen. The only way we're going to get there is through love and connection. Dr. Bashah, thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate all that you've done to help us work our way through this and to help me personally think about this from, I tend to think about it from a social science standpoint, a political standpoint, but you've really added a lot of context. The book was fun to write with you on addictive ideologies. Again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.